One of the most disturbing cases of family isolation and inbreeding ever documented in the United States was revealed to the public in Owsley County, Kentucky, on September 27, 1981. Owsley, located in the heart of the Appalachians, was already known as one of America's poorest counties, a place where families had lived in isolated valleys for generations, separated from the rest of the world by impossible mountains and roads that became inaccessible during the harsh winters. Under a fine drizzle that shrouded the mountains in mist on that specific day, a state social services team conducting routine visits to unregistered properties came across a deteriorated house in the region known as La Rose. The property was almost 5 miles from the main road, accessible only by a dirt path winding between pine trees and century-old oaks. What they found would change the silent history of that valley forever. The house was a wooden structure, darkened by time, with no windows, only openings covered by pieces of plastic and cardboard. Obvious holes were in the roof, and the surrounding land was overtaken by tall weeds and rust. The unusual silence was the first thing that caught the social workers' attention. Even on the most isolated properties, there were always sounds, chickens, an old radio, conversations. There, the silence seemed like an entity of its own. When they knocked, an elderly-looking woman, later identified as 72-year-old Martha Bram, greeted them. She tried to prevent the assistants from entering, but the strong odor emanating from inside and the visibly debilitated appearance of the elderly woman justified immediate intervention. Inside that house, which had no electricity or running water, lived 6 people: Martha, her 49-year-old daughter Eloise Bram, and 4 younger women, later identified as Eloise's daughters. The 4 women, approximately between 18 and 30 years old, presented alarming physical characteristics: asymmetrical faces, severe strabismus, prominent jaws, and, most notably, an evident difficulty in communication. None of them spoke clearly, only emitting guttural sounds and rudimentary phrases that only they seemed to understand. The scene impressed even the most experienced social workers. In their official reports, they described the women moving through the space like ghosts, apparently without fully recognizing our presence. Their movements were uncoordinated, and all exhibited repetitive mannerisms, such as rocking back and forth continuously. The total absence of records was most disturbing. None of the 4 women had a birth certificate, school record, or any official document. It was as if they didn't exist to the world beyond those walls. That case would be just the beginning of the discovery of a history of inbreeding that extended for decades, an invisible cycle of isolation, abuse, and neglect that produced one of the clearest examples of the devastating effects of continued family crossbreeding. While the authorities tried to understand what they were seeing, the 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, names they would receive later, as they had no official identities, remained seated on the dirt floor, as if that interruption in routine was just a brief inconvenience in decades of silence. The true story of those women, however, had begun much earlier, in another era of Kentucky, when geographical and cultural isolation formed the perfect setting for a family to close in on itself for generations. If you want to follow more cases like this, which shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. After the initial discovery, county authorities faced an unprecedented challenge: how to investigate a situation where there were practically no records, external witnesses, or any formal documentation. The 4 women were immediately taken to Cumberland Valley Regional Hospital for medical evaluation, while Eloise and Martha remained in custody. Dated September 30, 1981, the first medical reports revealed an alarming picture. The 4 sisters presented a series of physical and cognitive characteristics compatible with what doctors at the time called degeneration by inbreeding. Dr. Robert Harkins, head of the medical team, noted in his confidential report, "We are facing a case where family endogamy seems to have occurred for multiple generations, resulting in classic manifestations of accumulated recessive disorders." The investigation into the family history faced significant obstacles from the beginning. Martha Bram refused to cooperate, claiming that family matters are nobody's business. The little information she provided was contradictory and vague. Eloise, in turn, presented limited cognitive capacity and showed evident signs of deep psychological trauma. It was through parish records from the local Baptist church and testimonies from distant neighbors that investigators began to piece together the macabre puzzle of the Bram lineage. The first clues pointed to a history dating back to the 1920s, when William Bram, Eloise's father, established himself in that isolated region after leaving a mining community in Harland County. One of the most important testimonies came from Joseph Miller, then 83 years old, who had lived about 2 miles from the Bram property since 1925. According to his account to social worker Margaret Thompson on October 5, 1981, William was a strange man who didn't allow anyone near his property. He married a second cousin, Sally, who already had trouble speaking properly. After she died in childbirth of one of the children around 1940, we never saw an adult woman in that house again, just little Eloise growing up. The other children, 2 boys, also never left there, he stated. Another crucial point in the investigation was the testimony of Florence Watson, a midwife who had worked in the region since the 1930s. In her statement on October 12, 1981, she revealed, "I was called to the Bram property in 1945 to help with the birth of a young woman. When I arrived, I saw that it was Eloise, only 13 years old, pregnant and in labor. William didn't let me stay after the baby was born, a boy. I tried to alert the sheriff at the time, but nobody wanted to get involved with the Brams." The investigation began to focus on reconstructing the chronology of births on the property. Between 1945 and 1963, Eloise apparently gave birth to 6 children, including the 4 women found in 1981. There were no formal records of any of these births, and the absence of genetic tests at the time made it impossible to determine with certainty the paternity of each one. However, the clinical evaluation and collected testimonies indicated a disturbing scenario. William Bram had not only abused his own daughter, Eloise, but his sons, Eloise's brothers, apparently continued the incestuous cycle after his death in 1967, resulting in the birth of the 4 women. A false lead arose when investigators speculated about the possibility of the women belonging to an isolationist religious community, a theory quickly dismissed after consultations with experts on religious groups in the region. Another line of investigation considered a possible involvement with family clans producing moonshine, the illegally distilled liquor common in the region during and after the Prohibition era, but also found no concrete evidence. One of the most significant obstacles to the investigation was the sudden death of Martha Bram on October 29, 1981, just 1 month after the discovery of the case. The elderly woman died at the county hospital due to complications from pneumonia and malnutrition, taking with her many of the answers that investigators were seeking. By November 1981, the official investigation had established a predominant theory. William Bram initiated a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise in the 1940s, resulting in the birth of children who, in turn, continued the consanguineous cycle with their own mother and among themselves. The 4 women found in 1981 were the product of this complex genetic intertwining, being simultaneously daughters, sisters, and cousins in a family tree that folded in on itself. The Owsley County Prosecutor's Office faced an unprecedented dilemma: how to proceed legally in a case where the main witnesses and potential defendants had severe cognitive limitations or had already died. Additionally, the statute of limitations for many of the crimes had expired, considering that the initial abuses dated back to the 1940s. In an internal memo dated December 14, 1981, District Attorney Clarence Hammond wrote, "This case represents not only an unprecedented legal challenge but also a systemic failure of our social and community institutions. While we seek to hold accountable the potential perpetrators still alive, we must recognize that society as a whole has failed these women for decades." As the investigation advanced into 1982, significant discoveries began to emerge from the silent past of the Bram family. In January of that year, researchers from the University of Kentucky were called to evaluate the case from a broader medical and anthropological perspective. The team, led by Dr. Helen Montgomery, a specialist in population genetics, analyzed medical records and conducted extensive interviews with longtime residents of the region. One of the most revealing documents was found in the archives of the local church, a baptismal record book containing notes from Pastor Jonathan Williams dated 1935, where he expressed concern about the improper marriage between William Bram and his cousin Sally. The pastor wrote, "I visited the Bram family today and found a concerning situation. William and Sally share maternal grandparents, and signs that our ancestors would associate with too much mixed blood are already noticeable in the children. In March 1982, the investigation located a diary belonging to midwife Florence Watson, who had died in 1979. In the yellowed pages, they found detailed accounts of the births she attended at the Bram property between 1945 and 1963. In a particularly disturbing entry from August 1951, she wrote, "I was called again to the Bram house. Little Eloise, now 19 years old, gave birth to her third child. The child presents the same distant eyes as the others. No man besides William and his sons lives on that property. May God have mercy on those children." Florence's diary revealed that she had documented 6 births from Eloise in 1945, 1947, 1951, 1954, 1958, and 1963. The 4 women found in 1981 corresponded to the births of 1951, Agnes, 1954, Mary, 1958, Louise, and 1963, Catherine. There was no mention of the first 2 children in more recent records. A particularly impactful revelation came when the medical team performed cranial radiographs and detailed physical examinations of the 4 sisters. Dr. Samuel Pierce, a specialist in genetic disorders from the University Hospital, observed, "The patterns of bone, facial, and neurological anomalies present in the 4 women are consistent with the accumulation of deleterious recessive genes through multiple generations of inbreeding. Particularly notable are the symmetrical craniofacial malformations present in all of them, suggesting a very close common ancestor." In April 1982, an accidental discovery brought new light to the case. During repair works on a secondary road near the Bram property, workers found bone remains buried in a swampy terrain. The forensic analysis completed in June 1982 identified the remains as belonging to 2 children of approximately 2 and 5 years old who had been buried at least 30 years earlier. Although it was impossible to determine with certainty the identity of the children without genetic tests, which would only become available years later, the location and time corresponded to Eloise's first 2 children, who were never located. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came through a late testimony from Harriet Comolms, a social worker who had briefly visited the property in 1967 after receiving an anonymous complaint. In her statement in July 1982, she reported, "I arrived at the property and was greeted by Martha, who prevented me from entering. I could briefly see the interior through the half-open door. I saw several people sitting on the floor, including young women and at least 2 adult men. What impressed me was that they all rocked back and forth at the same rhythm, as if they were in a trance. Martha said they were just praying their way and that I should respect their religious beliefs." Comolms admitted that she did not insist on the inspection and did not formally record the incident due to pressure from the local community to not interfere in mountain matters. Her late testimony illustrated how cultural isolation and institutional neglect had allowed the cycle of abuse to persist for decades. In August 1982, investigators located a former postal worker who made deliveries in the region between 1960 and 1975. He reported that William Bram regularly received correspondence from a state institution in Frankfurt, likely related to social or agricultural benefits. This indicated that despite their isolation, the family maintained some minimal contact with government institutions, which, however, never conducted follow-up visits. A crucial piece of evidence emerged in September 1982 when Dr. Montgomery's team analyzed old photographs of the community and identified Eloise in a school photo from 1940, her only appearance in official records. The 8-year-old girl already showed subtle physical signs compatible with first-degree consanguinity, suggesting that the incestuous cycle could have begun even before her, possibly with her own parents. Throughout these months of investigation, the 4 sisters remained in a state institution for people with cognitive disabilities, where they received proper medical care and basic education for the first time. The institution's reports indicated modest but significant progress. After 6 months, Agnes and Mary could already communicate with simple phrases and learned basic self-care tasks. Louise and Catherine, the youngest, demonstrated greater adaptability and learning capacity. Leave in the comments, never give up on the truth, if you believe all missing persons deserve to be found. By the end of 1982, after more than a year of intensive investigation, Kentucky authorities had finally established what became known as the Bram case, one of the most extreme examples of family isolation and continuous inbreeding documented in the United States. The story that emerged was more complex and disturbing than the initial assumptions. William Bram, born in 1902, grew up in an isolated mining community in the Appalachians, where marriages between cousins were relatively common due to geographical and cultural isolation. In 1920, he married his second cousin, Sally Jenkins, with whom he had 3 children, Eloise, born in 1932, and 2 boys, Jacob, 1934, and Caleb, 1936. After Sally's death during the birth of a 4th stillborn child in 1938, William isolated the family even more, moving to a remote property in Owsley County. It was there, as investigators determined, that he initiated a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise, resulting in the birth of her first child in 1945 when she was only 13 years old. From there, the horror multiplied. Both William and his sons, Jacob and Caleb, maintained incestuous relationships with Eloise, creating a complex genetic web where the subsequent children born were simultaneously siblings, half-siblings, and cousins. Martha, William's mother-in-law, and Sally's mother, remained on the property throughout this period, apparently accepting or unable to prevent what was happening. The final legal documents compiled in December 1982 established the following timeline and genealogy. 1945, birth of Eloise's first child, paternity attributed to William, her own father. This child, a boy, died at age 2 and was buried on the property. 1947, birth of the second child, uncertain paternity between William and Jacob, father or brother of Eloise. This child also died in early childhood. 1951, birth of Agnes, paternity attributed to Caleb, Eloise's brother. 1954, birth of Mary, paternity attributed to Jacob, Eloise's brother. 1958, birth of Louise, paternity possibly attributed to the son born in 1945, Eloise's son and brother, before his death. 1963, birth of Catherine, paternity attributed to William, shortly before his death. The genetic implications were profound. Dr. Samuel Pierce explained in his final report, this case represents an extreme example of multi-generational consanguinity where the coefficient of inbreeding reached levels rarely documented in modern medical literature. The phenotypic manifestations observed in the 4 surviving women are consistent with the homozygotic expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes. In medical terms, the 4 sisters presented a constellation of rare genetic conditions, including moderate microcephaly, characteristic craniofacial deformities, moderate to severe intellectual disability, skeletal anomalies, particularly in the extremities, congenital heart problems in 3 of them, partial hearing loss, and neurological disorders manifested as repetitive movements and communication difficulties. The legal resolution of the case was complicated by several factors. William Bram had died in 1967. Jacob and Caleb, who would have been between 46 and 48 years old in 1982, were never located. Investigators suspected they had also died or left the region years before. Eloise, at 50 years old in 1982, was assessed as severely cognitively compromised and unable to legally answer for her actions. On February 14, 1983, Judge Howard Thornton issued his final decision. Eloise Bram was declared legally incapable and sent to a state institution for long-term care. There were no formal criminal charges due to the death of the main perpetrators and Eloise's mental state. The 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, became wards of the state of Kentucky, remaining in specialized institutions. The impact of the case on the local community and state institutions was profound. In March 1983, the Kentucky Department of Social Services instituted a new protocol for regular visits to isolated properties, especially in mountainous regions with a history of cultural isolation. State legislation was revised to strengthen child protection mechanisms and abuse prevention. For the small community of Owsley County, the case represented a turning point. The silence that had allowed horror to perpetuate for decades was finally broken. In an editorial in the local Owsley County News in April 1983, the editor wrote, "For too long, we have hidden our eyes behind the notion of family privacy and mountain autonomy. The Bram case teaches us a painful lesson about the price of silence and collective indifference. The subsequent developments of the case revealed more about the lasting impact of extreme inbreeding. Throughout the 1980s, the four sisters received medical treatments and special education they had never had access to before. The institution's reports documented slow but significant progress. Agnes, the oldest, never developed complete speech but learned basic sign communication and could perform simple tasks with supervision. She died in 1997 due to cardiac complications at the age of 46. Mary demonstrated greater adaptability, learning to read simple words and developing notable artistic abilities. Her drawings, often depicting four female figures holding hands, were preserved by the institution. She died in 2001 at age 47 due to a respiratory infection. Louise, considered the most resilient of the four, eventually managed to work on supervised tasks in the institution's laundry and develop basic social relationships with staff and other residents. She died in 2008 at the age of 50. Catherine, the youngest, presented the most significant cognitive gains after receiving adequate stimulation. In 1990, she was transferred to a residential group environment with supervision, where she lived until her death in 2012 at the age of 49. The old Bram property, the scene of decades of horror, was eventually taken by the state for lack of tax payment. In 1990, the deteriorated structure was demolished, and the area gradually returned to nature. Today, few local residents can identify the exact location where the house stood. In 2002, a discreet memorial was established in the county cemetery dedicated to the Bram sisters and all silent victims of isolation and neglect. The plaque contains only 4 names: Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, without dates or additional details, a silent testimony to lives that almost went unnoticed by society. The legacy of the Bram case persists as a somber reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and institutional neglect. The story of the 4 sisters from Kentucky has become a case study in social service and medical colleges, illustrating the devastating effects of continued inbreeding and the critical importance of social protection systems. In a retrospective report published in 2010 by the Kentucky Department of Health and Human Services, the commissioner wrote, "The Bram case represents a systemic failure that transcends specific individuals or departments. It was a failure of an entire society to recognize and protect its most vulnerable members. The lessons learned continue to shape our policies and practices to this day." Beyond the medical and legal aspects, the case raises profound questions about community, collective responsibility, and the complicit silence that sometimes allows horror to flourish in the shadows. As Dr. Helen Montgomery observed in her final report on the case, the tragedy of the Bram sisters was not just the result of horrible acts committed by individuals, but also of countless acts of omission by neighbors, officials, and institutions that preferred not to see what was before their eyes. Today, the case remains one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding documented in American medical history, not only for the degree of genetic proximity involved but for the duration of the incestuous cycle over multiple generations. The physical and cognitive characteristics of the 4 sisters offered researchers rare insights into the cumulative effects of severe endogamy in humans. The most inbred women of Kentucky, as they became known, never knew about the impact their existences would have on medicine, child protection legislation, and public awareness. They lived and died in a limited world, first by the walls of a windowless house, then by the gentler walls of the institutions that finally offered them care. If you watch this far, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth." Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who are also interested in real cases that make us reflect on the limits of the human condition.